When reflecting on how our musical friends of the past might have played their music, as for instance Bach, Mozart, Beethoven or Chopin, the most diverse projections come to surface. Oftentimes that imaginary vision of Beethoven or Chopin is inspired more than we realize on our personal experience with their music. In other words, there exist as many historical pictures of Chopin and Beethoven as there are admirers of their music. So, no surprise that any attempt to reconstruct even the smallest detail of an historical context around these composers often is accompanied by emotional debates. Certainly, when one talks about reconstructing historical tempi, the conversation rises sometimes in temperatures more than one would wish it did. But there is no denial to the fact that one of the most objective factors in reconstructing the way, for instance, Beethoven played exactly lies in the many tempo indications he left. Certainly in the time of the metronome, those numbers are treasures of information, signposts almost on our way back into history. Since by knowing the exact tempo Beethoven had in mind for his symphonies or Chopin for his etudes, we do have important information to start from. Since isn't the choice of tempo dictating many, if not all, other parameters of a musical performance? Changing tempo is changing everything. But those metronome numbers often indeed lead to heated debates because of the speeds they seem to represent. And instead of openly asking ourselves the question what really was meant by Beethoven or Chopin, our still post-industrial attitude, focusing almost solely on technical expansion, oftentimes narrows this interesting issue to the question whether it would be really impossible for musicians to reach those insane numbers. But how interesting a discussion on how fast someone can play may seem for social media's comment boxes, as is the lack of systematic recordings performed in half a single beat reading to back those claims, by the way, would it not be more important to know what contemporaries had to say on what they considered to be an absolute maximum speed for the musicians of their time? And are we lucky to have some really cool historical sources that exactly inform us on this aspect? The sources that I'm about to present to you range from the 17th century till late 19th century. An absolute maximum of 10 notes a second seems to be a number that keeps coming back from mid-17th century till late 19th century. It's only in 1899 that we will meet playing speeds up to 12 notes a second, reserved for the greatest virtuosos like Tausig, Rubinstein and Bülow, and already considered to be on the edge of turning music into a clustered sound cloud, instead of an understandable and perceptible medium. Still far below the requirements, even the simple Czerny opening etudes of his Opus 299 post upon the learning student in 1839, at least if one sticks to read his metronome number not in the historical, but in our modern way of reading. So here we go. Our first source dates from 1736, in the time where Father Bach had reached the top of his creative powers. Joseph Haydn just celebrated his 4th birthday. The Dutch scientist Peter van Musschenbroek published a large work on natuurkunde, physics in English. Van Musschenbroek was a strong voice in Europe's 18th century scientific world. He studied with Isaac Newton, was member of the French Academy of Science, and wrote numerous works that are quoted till deep in the 19th century. As was the case in 1864, where a certain Professor Vellacker quotes van Musschenbroek in a history of the Steinwarte, the observatory of the Kremmunster Abbey. I'll give the quote from the German book, as it makes clear that what van Musschenbroek wrote in 1739 still was considered to be valid in 1864. Van Musschenbroek first states that tempo words like andante, allegro and presto never seem to exactly point a musician to the correct tempo a composer had in mind for his composition. He pleads for the use of a certain taktmesser, a tempo measurer, a kind of pendulum as for instance the French scientist Saveur already had described. He sees the necessity of a device like this, but feels unable to predict if the world would generally accept this. And I quote, "Time will tell when or if such taktmessers, by which the most precise indication of a musical tempo could be set, would be generally accepted." End of quote. Then he continues to talk about note values and which ones are used the most and why. And then comes this fabulous description of how many notes could be expected per second from a professional violinist. And I quote, "Experience learns that the trained musician who plays prestissimo on the violin will play 9, maximum 10 notes a second. This is also the maximum number of notes he can distinguish." End of quote. Musschenbroek elaborates on the distinguishability in his last sentence. I quote, "Also, when a single note still must be audible, the speed may not be faster than 1/10 of a time second." End of quote. So that's clear. In 1739 and at least in 1864, according to our friend Velker, maximum playing speeds are 10 notes a second. That's also the maximum limit we can perceive individual notes. Translated into a metronome number and today's half-beat or single-beat reading, this would result in quarter note 150 or half note 75 for a prestissimo, to be clear. Before we move to an important source of 1899, compare this to the speed of 18.4 notes a second. Karl Czerny requires an etude number 30 and 31 of his daily exercises, both marked velocissimo. Besides the fact no reasonable human being will raise his finger claiming this is possible, note what happens when you apply the whole beat reading to that metronome number. Suddenly, the 18.4 notes a second become 9.2, nicely fitting into the 9 till 10 notes a second described here. And just another sidestep here to Benjamin Carr, born in the UK in 1769, who died in 1831 after a successful life in the United States. In his Analytical Instructor for the Pianoforte from 1826, he gives rule of thumbs for his beginning students in defining the tempo for the works they play. He uses a watch and the reference to the second on that watch, or he doesn't give metronome numbers, but I'll translate those speeds into metronome numbers here. I give the quote also on screen. For normal cases, normal notations I'd say, his system is really simple and correct. The middle tempo is called allegretto. It refers to the second, so set at quarter note 60. Adagio is half of that, and prestissimo set at double the speed, so half note 60. So, doubling the speed compared to the allegretto or the tempo ordinario in his eyes. 60 for the minim, with the normal notation, so 16th notes, results in 8 notes a second. Not only falling into the range of the absolute maximum van Musschenbroek sets, but also perfectly aligned to the whole beat reading of our simple Czerny Opus 299 opening etudes. The first one not going in a ridiculous 14.4 notes a second, but in 7.2. Czerny marks this as a presto, where for Carr, seen as instruction as for beginners, this would already be a prestissimo. Now, the question of audibility is something physicists researched a lot throughout times, as for instance Jean Saury in 1777, and I quote, "When musicians play prestissimo, they perform normally on the violin in 9 or 10 notes per second." End of quote. He explains further it wouldn't make sense to even want to play faster than this because, and I quote, "one would not even distinguish the sounds still if one would play faster." End of quote. Or Michael Hube in 1794, 3 years after Mozart's death, and I quote, "From experience we can say that when we play as fast as possible on the violin we can distinguish maximum 9 notes a second." End of quote. Or a certain Mr. Illenburg writes in 1882 in an article for the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, "Spielen kann man in einer Minute höchstens ungefähr 600 Töne. or in English, playing is only possible up to about 600 tones a minute. So again, the famous limit of 10 notes a second. And note that we are here landing in 1882. So that's the time of the last years of Franz Liszt. Let's end by the interesting case of Oscar Rijf. Rijf, born in 1847 in The Hague in the Netherlands, got access in 1867 at age 20 to the class of Karl Tausig, the famous student of Liszt in Berlin. And he was appointed since 1875 professor at the Königliche Hochschule in Berlin, where he would remain until his premature death in 1899. A year before his death, Rijf started to write some articles that were only published in 1901. And one of those is extremely interesting for us, titled Über Fingerfertigkeit beim Klavierspiel, or in English, On Finger Dexterity in Piano Playing. We are now entering the time of Isidore Philippe, by the way. Remember the series of 4 videos I made recently? I'll link them here. So there we go. The article is written perfectly in accordance with the time spirit, not only to research the maximum speed limits for pianists, but also coming up with a method how to practice in order to increase speed in piano playing. Rijf gives metronome numbers, and they are undoubtedly to be read in half beat or single beat, as we still do today. We will see that his maximum lies on 12 notes a second. I quote, "A trill of 8 till 12 notes a second is the limit to what our ear still will hear as a musical trill. This implies that the limits of what our ear can distinguish aligns with the limit of our finger capacities." End of quote. In other words, 12 notes a second is the maximum speed pianists can reach according to Rijf, and not to forget one of Tausig's best students. But there is more. For a very short run, a C major scale over 2 octaves, speeds up to 15 notes a second can be attained in the most extreme cases one can imagine. As an in-between here, that's very similar to the famous run of Beethoven's Sonata Opus 31 number 3, page 2, where in the tempo of Czerny, one would have to play for a very short while 30 notes a second, if Czerny's metronome numbers were to be read half or single beat. Even in whole beat, this results in 15 notes a second for a very short while, and no excuses here to slow down. Czerny explicitly writes on this particular bar not to give in on the tempo. So the 15 notes a second Rijf describes as exceptional, and for the listeners to be the absolute limit of piano playing, is reserved only for a very short run in a C major scale. He returns to his magical 12 notes a second, and I quote, "The 16th notes from the last part of Mendelssohn's G minor concerto is played by our famous Schnellspieler, so fast players, in a tempo of dotted half note 60, resulting in 12 notes a second." End of quote. The metronome number here is a bit strange, by the way, using a ternary note value for a piece written in 4/4, but that as a side remark. Anyway, we read next that also the greatest virtuosos of his time, Tausig, Rubinstein, Bülow, reached, not surprisingly perhaps, at their top not more than 12 notes a second. Finally, Rijf experimented with his students to increase the speed of their scales, and for the left hand, this resulted with no exception in 10 notes a second only. The right hand was superior with all of them, with a limit of 12.4 notes a second. So, remember the insane 16, 17, 18, all the way up to 23 notes a second Isidore Philippe demands in his etudes? See what happens when indeed apply whole beat to his metronome indications. You can count for yourself. Yes, the 23 notes become 11.5, so right below that magical 12 notes per second margin. Now, I hurry to say that the last word about this period, that certainly is a transition period from whole beat to our modern half beat reading, has not been said. The more you dive into the period, let's say 1870, 1920, the more one starts to seeing things that is truly interesting and probably also essential to reconstruct. Lots of work to do, if only one does the work with historical integrity, not to backwards prove on its own weird claim that our current way of playing hasn't changed over the last 2.5 centuries. We could add Mersen's 10 notes a second as a documented maximum in the 17th century to the row of numbers. So, covering 3 centuries of documented maximum speeds and performance practice now. How cool is that? Steady from mid 17th century till mid 19th century at 10 notes a second. And towards the end of the 19th century, attempts were made to increase that speed up to 12.4 notes a second, where still this speed was reserved for scales and some runs in pieces. That means that objectively, hundreds, if not thousands of metronome numbers given in the 19th century either historically can be defined as absolute nonsense since they surpass a number of 12 notes a second, or we apply the whole beat reading to those metronome numbers, which not only makes them playable, not always easy in case you would have hoped that, it makes the tempi fall in line with what we know from notation and tempo ordinario, aligns these numbers with alternative descriptions of tempi like Benjamin Carr or Hotteter, which we will bring soon, and finally, bring the tempi in accordance with the descriptions of maximum speeds quoted by 17th, 18th and 19th century musicians. So, what needs to be added here? Perhaps a reference to a video that introduces you into the historical whole beat reading of metronome numbers? You'll find it over here. Or sit back and watch our 4-part series on Isidore Philippe over there. And if you would like to see more of this, it would be great to welcome you as a member of our awesome Patreon community. Link below, all in the description box. Thanks for watching and see you soon again. Bye.